Hello and welcome to Talking Points. I'm Dave Kelly, Director of Advanced Media Production at Cal State Long Beach. Today we're going to focus on those bushy-tailed little creatures that inhabit our city parks, our trees, and sometimes even our backyards. We're talking about squirrels. My guest today is Dr. Brett Mizelle. Dr. Mizelle is a professor of history and he is also the director of the American Studies program. Welcome, Brett, for what is now your third visit here at Talking Points.
Thanks for having me.
Well, you've done a lot of research on squirrels of late because you've been writing a book about squirrels, and so this has led you down a lot of trails in terms of where squirrels live, how they inhabit our city parks, also a lot of research about wild squirrels and so forth, and we'll talk about that as we go along. So we're going to tap into your knowledge base during the course of today's program. So let's start with the difficult question first. This is the $64,000 challenging question about squirrels. You know, there seems to be, particularly when we talk about the urban squirrels, there seems to be two mindsets. One mindset is, well, they are lovable, bushy-tailed little creatures that scurry around, and they seem to be very amenable to human beings. They like to be fed. They come up close. They're very bold. They're just really cute. And then the other mindset is that, no, they're pests. They climb up onto roofs, they get into attics, they get into garbage cans, they chew on wires, causing lots of trouble with electrical wires, and they take over the backyard. So here's the question. Are squirrels, urban squirrels in particular, are they lovable little creatures or are they pests that we have to endure and deal with?
Yeah, they're definitely both, as you mentioned. They're really both. It really depends. You meet people who are pro-squirrel people who just love them. You meet people who hate them and refer to them as rats with bushy tails. And it really depends on one's experience with them. If you own a house and they get into your garage or attic and you hear them scurrying around or they're destroying your garden plants, then they tend to be obviously in that pest category and people really don't like them. But for the most part, people seem to be pretty tolerant and kind of interested in squirrels. They're one of the few animals, wild animals, we get to see closely and often every day in many cases. So it's a real kind of important wildlife encounter for many people. But you're right about the damage they cause. The power industry keeps a statistic on power outages caused by squirrels. They think almost 20% of all power outages in the United States are caused by squirrels, either chewing through lines or accidentally bridging two contacts and creating a power outage. So they can be a real nuisance in a lot of cases for both individuals, and for all of us when the power goes out on a hot day.
Well, there's also a term called squirrely that we apply to humans and even to machines. If someone is acting in an erratic way, or they seem hyperactive, or they're out of control, or they're unreliable, we refer to them as squirrely. Same with our computers and our machines. Why is that term squirrely, that kind of behavior, why is it attributed to squirrels?
Yeah, I think the term comes from obviously watching the activity of squirrels, the way they run around and chase each other, and they seem like they don't ever do anything by operating kind of in a straight line, right? So there's that kind of sense of kind of their unreliability, which of course is funny because in fact, as we'll probably talk about later, they are actually quite smart and intelligent creatures in terms of knowing where they are. That sense of kind of the negative use of squirrels to describe things is an interesting reminder of the stories about the power grid, because now we take the power grid as natural. And when a squirrel destroys the power grid, that seems to be almost like a terrorist act against human beings. But in fact, it's the squirrel just doing its natural kind of thing, and we happen to take that behavior and attribute it to humans in interesting ways.
And there's been a complicated relationship between humans and squirrels over the years, for many years. And I know you've done the research in the history of human understanding of squirrels and some iconography about squirrels over the years. But here in America, squirrels have been seen as a food source, particularly in the South before World War II. So they were hunted for food, and there were recipes and cookbooks that you've mentioned for squirrel dishes. But after the war, when the economy got more productive for people, and as people were able to no longer rely on hunting squirrels, which was seen as poor people's food, they wanted to get their food from the grocery store, and hunting is not as important as it once was. So as a result, we no longer eat squirrels that much, and now they've become cultural icons and cartoon heroes. So how did we go from eating squirrels to now revering them as cultural icons.
Yeah, the decline of squirrel hunting is one of the most interesting parts of the book I'm working on. Is it used to be incredibly common. They were an important subsistence food item for many peoples for many, many centuries, really, in the United States. And it's largely entirely disappeared for many of the reasons you've talked about. And I think that it's particularly disappeared because they were associated with hard times. Squirrels were, something that you kind of ate when you didn't have anything else to put on the table, or would include kind of with other ingredients. I had an interesting conversation about this because one of the things in all of the kind of new food movement, foodie culture, almost all kinds of other foods have come back. You hear a lot about nose to tail eating, people eating all kinds of parts of the hog, for example. But one of the animals that's not come back at all in restaurants or cookbooks are squirrels, right? It's just not come back. And I think it's that association with kind of poverty, hard times, that make it really kind of impossible to do it. There are a couple of restaurants that have tried to bring squirrels back, but I think people are like, now they're kind of cute, right? They're now seen less as an agricultural item and more as kind of like the friendly animal you see in the park. So I think there's also kind of an increasing revulsion against eating squirrels because they now seem cute, pet-like.
And of course, they have become cartoon characters too.
Oh, for sure, yeah. So the real big move there is all in the post-war period. So you get Rocky and Bullwinkle. So Rocket J. Squirrel is a flying squirrel, one of the three types of squirrels. You get the famous chipmunks, Alvin and the Chipmunks and Chip and Dale. They're also in the squirrel family. You get all kinds of other kind of pop culture squirrels. The most popular now being Scrat, which is kind of the prehistoric saber-toothed squirrel in the Ice Age movies. And I think that plays a role in it, right? Once you kind of have a cultural imagination of an animal that kind of humanizes it, makes it funny and makes it cute, it becomes an item. It becomes an animal that's not an animal you're going to eat anymore in the same kind of way.
And there are a large variety of squirrels out there and that are part of the squirrel family. So let's do a little classification now. How many squirrels do exist within the squirrel family? And if we had a photo album of that family, who would be the most recognizable creatures?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Squirrels are part of the family Squirrelidae, and there are 285 species in there. A lot of different squirrels pretty much everywhere on the planet except kind of the polar regions and the deserts. But the best way to think about squirrels is they really break down into three categories. Tree squirrels, which is what we're most familiar with. So we see a lot of gray squirrels and fox squirrels here in California. Flying squirrels, which are pretty rare, they're largely nocturnal. And then ground squirrels, of which we also have a lot in California. So the kind of family portrait would probably be organized by those groups to kind of think of those squirrels. Plus we also have the also very charismatic large ground squirrels. So woodchucks, marmots, and prairie dogs are also squirrels. So they're all kind of similar that way. And once you start thinking of them that way, they all kind of appear together. As a kind of very similar and allied set of animals.
And then we also have the distinction between wild squirrels and the urban squirrels that we've been talking about. What is the difference between the two, the wild squirrels and the urban squirrels, and how do urban squirrels become so accustomed to people as opposed to wild squirrels not so much?
Yeah, the story of urban squirrels is a really interesting one because as Americans urbanized particularly the east coast of the United States and built cities, most squirrels were driven out. There were no forests, there wasn't the habitat, there wasn't the food source. So most urban squirrels were originally in the 19th century introduced into cities on purpose. They were brought there by urban planners to kind of beautify parks when they built new parks like Central Park in New York City, for example. So squirrels were brought in to be kind of entertaining and educational, kind of a source of kind of moral concern. And then of course they've thrived in this environment because we feed them. We build houses and other buildings that provide nesting spaces for squirrels. I think a lot of how hospitable like this campus is to squirrels, right? There are students who will feed them. There are slices of pizza and bagels left in garbage cans all around the campus. So squirrels are what we call synanthropic. They're animals that really thrive kind of in the human environment, the environment we've made.
And since you mentioned food, what are the limitations of the food supply that squirrels can partake in? And what is their favorite kind of food?
Yeah, well, squirrels are immediately associated in the popular imagination with nuts, right? Which I think also goes back to that idea about squirrely, kind of crazy, right? Squirrels and nuts, the idea of someone being nuts. So nuts and seeds really are the main thing. They really are tied to those food sources, but they're broadly herbivorous, so they'll pretty much eat any kind of plant item, berries, grains, and so forth. Squirrels have been known to eat insects, small snakes even, these types of things, but for the most part, they really kind of thrive on plants, but they'll also eat the things we provide for them. I've seen squirrels on campus with donuts, bagels, corn chips, pretty much any kind of snack a student would leave lying around, they'll take advantage of because it's important to find food source. Makes it easier for them if they can get their food for free as opposed to having to forage for it themselves.
Well, when we talk about foraging and also hiding the acorns or gathering the acorns for winter, and you see this particularly in the northern climate where it's colder in the wintertime, they're very busy stashing away those acorns. So are those squirrels able to remember where they put their stashes? And why do we refer to squirreling away as sort of human hoarding behavior? What's the connection there?
Right, an excellent point about that. So squirrels need a lot of energy and calories, and they have to basically store the food they like, something like acorns, for example, when it's available. So squirrels have very sophisticated ways of kind of knowing. There's really good research on this done at UC Berkeley, of all places, where they have a big squirrel kind of studies lab. They will look at a particular acorn or nut, and they will determine whether it's one worth eating now or one worth saving. And then most tree squirrels in our area use what we call scatter hoarding. So they'll take their food items and they'll scatter them all over the place. They will even occasionally fake bury something to kind of put other squirrels kind of off the scent. And there's a lot of research being done about how they know where those items are. And part of it is that they also will sort like by like. So they'll put all kind of almonds in one place, all kinds of acorns in one place to try to remember kind of where things are. So we're beginning to learn that squirrels have pretty sophisticated mental maps. And that's one of the two strategies they use when it comes to food hoarding. Most of the squirrels, again, here use the scatter method, but the ones you're thinking about, like the red squirrels or the Douglas squirrels, they'll create a hoard. They're larder hoarders. So they'll put all of their food in one place. So they'll be more defensive, right? They'll have to defend that space. So often if you're hiking in the mountains, for example, when a squirrel starts chattering at you and kind of screaming at you, it means you're getting close to its hoard of food because they keep all their food in one place. And this is one reason squirrels have become such a great metaphor, right, in some ways for kind of humans, right? Be like the squirrel, right? The squirrel is someone who prepares for the future, understands he needs to put food away for later on. And so we often use squirrels as kind of an exemplar for kind of the lessons we need to learn as people.
And hence the term squirreling away.
Yeah, yeah.
Right, exactly. So do the squirrels actually perform a great service for the forest environment because of scattering those seeds and nuts and so forth around?
Yeah, absolutely, because they never retrieve all the nuts that they hide. And so one of the things that happens is they wind up spreading the seeds or the nuts, right? So particularly there's really great research done about kind of oak forests and forest succession. One of the reasons forests kind of expand and change is in part because squirrels bury and then forget their seeds that they've buried in the ground. One study I saw once said that they think about 75% of what's buried never gets found. So either another animal will find it to eat it, or it will then lead to the growth of kind of a new forest or new trees.
Great information, but we have to go to the break right now.
Okay.
So when we come back from the break, we will talk about the lifespan of the typical squirrel and what are the hazards that squirrels face, particularly in the urban environment. Stay with us.
Make a difference in our future by researching and helping to preserve our natural resources. The wide variety of careers in this field will have a huge impact on our lives while using the principles of engineering, chemistry, and biology to help find solutions to environmental problems. You could be a part of this exciting field with a degree from Cal State Long Beach.
Welcome back to Talking Points. I'm Dave Kelly. My guest today is Dr. Brett Mizelle. And Brett, before we went to the break, we were talking about how squirrels have this ability to sort the acorns and the various other nuts and place them in stashes, and they remember where those stashes are. So that suggests that the brains are pretty well developed, at least in the area of sorting and memory. What about the anatomy of squirrels? We see them as having big bushy tails, and we see them running pretty quickly, and we know they can jump across tree branch to tree branch and so on. Tell us a little more about the anatomy and what they're capable of.
Yeah, squirrels are really remarkable when you get to watch them and think about kind of how they do what they do. One of the things that's always impressive about particularly tree squirrels is they can rotate their rear ankles 180 degrees. And that's how they can climb down a tree face downward, right? So they can kind of go up and down the trees. So that's one adaptation for arboreal life. So are some adaptations in the brain, right? In terms of the ability to process basically rapid movements, the ability to jump and move through the tree canopy or to remember where kind of nuts are stored. So we're learning a lot about squirrels kind of in recent years because we've started to kind of pay attention to kind of what's really extraordinary about what they know. And even the other squirrels, I mean, you know, we haven't talked much about flying squirrels, but the fact that it can do that at all is really fascinating. Flying squirrels basically are gliders. gliders, right? They can jump off trees and often go incredibly long distances and change the steering of their motion by kind of adjusting their wingtips in ways that are very complicated that we're only now really able to study with really high-speed cameras, to slow down the types of motions that these animals make. So they're really remarkable and much more intelligent than people think.
And as we talk about the squirrels, we're talking about creatures that exist nocturnally and also during the daytime. Are they both?
Pretty much just daytime. They're crepuscular animals in that sense. So squirrels kind of are like we are. They live during the day, get up in the morning, spend their day kind of foraging and feeding, and then they go into bed at night basically in a dray, which is what you call a squirrel nest. And you'll see those scattered around campus, and they're often kind of large nests in kind of the crook of a tree is where they be. So they basically operate on the same kind of business hours people do for the most part. So they're not nocturnal in that sense.
But when you talk about ground squirrels, they have underground
tunnels. So many variations of type of squirrels. So ground squirrels live in large and well-developed underground kind of burrow systems with multiple tunnels and multiple entrances. And you get really complex kind of societies, particularly in prairie dogs, which have been quite well studied by kind of scientists for the kind of complexities of prairie dog society and socialization, even ideas of prairie dog language. Prairie dogs can use different signals to indicate whether a threat is coming from above, from a hawk, on the ground from a snake or a coyote. They can communicate different things about the color or the size of a predator. So we're learning a lot about kind of these complex societies, particularly among a lot of the ground squirrels.
When we talk about predators, what is the typical lifespan of a squirrel, and what are the predators that prey on them? And is being a squirrel a treacherous life?
Yeah, it's a really hard life. It's most squirrels kind of average 4 to 6 years is kind of where they go. But the biggest challenge is really only a quarter of squirrels make it to year 1. So there's a pretty high kind of mortality among squirrels. There are lots of threats to squirrels. Hawks are a big one, for example. Snakes, dogs, coyotes. A lot of domestic animals, cats and dogs, animals will get them as well. Obviously, in the urban environment, there are a whole host of other risks. Obviously, cars are a huge one in terms of kind of creating roadkill, electrocution, either when they accidentally cross different types of wires. So yeah, it's a very difficult life. In some captive situations, squirrels have lived up to 20 years. But for the most part, any squirrel above 6 years and maybe as high as 10 or 12 has had a very long life in the wild.
What about the rate of procreation? How many babies do they have every year?
Yeah, so typically squirrels, I'm thinking here again about tree squirrels, have kind of 1 litter a year of 1 to 4 kits. Is the amount they normally have. Although there can be more than 1 litter a year if the food sources allow it. And one of the things that has been studied on our campus, in fact, is that because the food sources here are so consistent, and there's the extra food sources provided by students, we often will have 2 litters per year in some places because the food sources allow that to happen. So it really is kind of dependent upon food and the availability of those resources.
What about in agricultural environments, such as in Central Valley or Northern California, where they have a lot of almond orchards? Is that a concern, the squirrels, because they are after the nuts, after all?
Yeah, it's a very big concern in both the kind of nut tree business and in the wine business of all things, actually. Ground squirrels are a major agricultural pest in California, not just for eating the actual plant or seed or fruit, but for chewing through irrigation lines or creating flooding or diverting irrigation water. So there's a very extensive state apparatus in terms of fumigation campaigns to kind of help agriculture, particularly in areas where the agricultural areas abet land where squirrels haven't been controlled. And there's a long, long history of this in California. One of the most interesting things I've learned in working on the project was that in 1918, during World War I, California declared war on its ground squirrels. And there was a squirrel week where Californians were encouraged to kill as many squirrels as they could. There were competitions done by schools. And the sense was that these ground squirrels were eating so much of the crops that were needed, in fact, to feed both people at home and the GIs fighting World War I.
Well, what about people that are passionate about rescuing squirrels that have been abandoned, particularly baby squirrels or squirrels that are injured? They can be rescued, they can be rehabilitated, and presumably they're turned back into the wild as soon as they're able to survive in the wild. But can they be domesticated? Can squirrels be domesticated? And if so, is it a bad idea?
Yeah, I'll start with the rehabilitation thing first. I've met as part of researching this book some fantastic wildlife rehabilitation people. And yeah, they often take in baby squirrels. They often tell people, by the way, if you see a baby squirrel, don't pick it up right away, maybe back away and wait for a few minutes, because often the parents might be moving the squirrel from one place to another. If it's fallen out of the nest, the mother will come back and retrieve it and take it back up there. But many times they pick up or are given or told by the public to take in these baby squirrels that are orphaned. And yes, they can be raised. There's special squirrel formula that you feed with an eyedropper. You can eventually raise them and release most squirrels. So most get put back into the public. As for domestication, generally a terrible idea, but there's a fascinating history of people having squirrels as pets. Benjamin Franklin had a pet squirrel that he loved and wrote a very lovely kind of obituary for, who was named Mungo. In the 19th century, squirrels were a very popular kind of occasional pets. They were the most popular wild animal pet in American history, really until the post-World War II period, when we start kind of banning the keeping of wild animals as pets. So they're illegal almost everywhere. They can't really be domesticated. People do keep them in their houses, but they're mainly in cages much of the day because they are a wild animal. They have sharp claws, really sharp teeth. They have some very specific kind of health needs and needs to be able to run around and jump and so forth. So they don't particularly make good pets. But I do follow on Instagram several people who have really hundreds of thousands of followers who talk about and share pictures of their pet squirrel experiences today.
And if the squirrel is domesticated, it's in the house and it gets out of the cage, what kind of damage can it wreak in the house?
Tons of damage, yeah. I mean, apparently, unless you have a squirrel that you've really developed a relationship with, particularly from when it's a baby, sometimes they'll be a little easier to take care of and kind of feed. You can just imagine a squirrel tearing up your couch to bury something inside it, right? I mean, that they have very sharp claws. They're hardwired in essence to kind of bury and hide things if you have a tree squirrel. So I think they can do a lot of damage and scratch stuff up in your house. Weirdly, or maybe not weirdly, the folks who talk about their pet squirrels tend not to show any of the dark side of it. They tend to show really cute pictures, right, of the squirrel sleeping or leaping from the cage to your body.
Well, other than being pets, is it pretty clear that squirrels are the most adaptable kind of creature that we've come across, particularly in urban environments?
Yeah, they're certainly up there, I would suggest, in terms of their ability to live in different kind of places and really kind of thrive under all kinds of circumstances. As I mentioned, squirrels as a species, when you think of the whole larger system of squirrels, exist in most of the places of the world that are habitable. So, there's really a great variety of types of squirrels everywhere. They're very adaptable, very resilient.
And what about some of the things that are going on around the world with squirrels? We hear that there are some squirrels that do better in certain environments than others. Sometimes when squirrels are introduced into certain urban environments, they displace the native squirrels that were once there. So let's talk about that for a moment. Why are some squirrels better adapted to certain environments than others, and what is the reason for one squirrel population dominating over another?
Yeah, this was one of the most interesting things I discovered. Was I thought about the squirrels on our campus here at Long Beach State, and we have fox squirrels, but all of the fox squirrels here were introduced to the Sepulveda Veterans Home in the late 19th century. They were brought by Civil War and Spanish-American War veterans, and they've gradually expanded from that part of Los Angeles all around greater Southern California. So squirrels are very adaptable. Those squirrels have largely pushed away western gray squirrels where we are in our particular location. But the real big crisis is when those gray squirrels, eastern gray squirrels, were introduced into Great Britain in the 1870s. So a lot of large landowners thought, oh, it would be lovely to have these beautiful American animals in our estates. But of course, in the subsequent 150 years, they've largely driven the indigenous red squirrel, which is one of the symbols of Great Britain, the animal we think about a lot in Beatrix Potter. Like Squirrel Nutkin is a red squirrel. They've largely driven them to extinction, and it's partly because of their size. They just kind of outcompete those other squirrels. They can find the nuts those squirrels have hidden, so the red squirrels are weaker. They don't have as much body mass. They don't reproduce as well. Our squirrels also, the gray American squirrels, brought a squirrel pox with them that the red squirrels didn't have. So it's a real crisis in some parts of, particularly the UK and parts of Europe, that they're losing their indigenous squirrels to our American squirrels as a form of an invasive species.
And there's a lot of concern about this in Britain today?
Tremendous. There have been projects over the last 100 years to first of all kill all of the squirrels, and it's always described in nationalist terms. So one of the things I've discovered researching the book are these amazing kind of pieces like kill the American squirrels, or those damned Americans coming in, taking over our territory. There's now a sizable red squirrel population left in Scotland, and there are many squirrel preserves on islands in particular, like some of the Scottish Isles. But there's been very little success overall, despite the fact fact that at one point the British government gave away free ammunition to anyone who would use it to kill American gray squirrels. So it's a real kind of crisis there, and there are pro-red squirrel groups. Then there are other groups that say, well, save the grays. It's not their fault, right? Why are we killing them? Because Britain sees itself as a nation of animal lovers. So it's a very, very contested topic there to this very day.
When we talk about squirrels, they are basically in the same family as rodents, is that correct? Mm-hmm. And so with rats, we clearly don't like the rats. No one really, unless you have a pet rat or something, most people don't want rats around. And we associate rats with diseases, with the plague, with fleas, even with rabies and things of that nature, various diseases. Are those kinds of things also prevalent with squirrels or not?
They're actually not. One of the things that always surprised me was that squirrels are not really, they don't get rabies very often. I think there's been no account ever of rabies, for example, being spread from a squirrel to a human. I think squirrels benefit a lot from that amazing tail of theirs, right? The rat has this kind of stringy kind of tail, where the squirrel typically has this beautiful bushy kind of tail that serves all kinds of awesome functions for thermoregulation and so forth. And there's something about them just being kind of fuzzier and cuter, perhaps, that has allowed squirrels to avoid some of the bad reputation that we associate with other rodents.
Okay, and we've run out of time, unfortunately, but I'm going to give you about 20 seconds to tell us what your favorite part of researching this project was.
Yeah, my favorite part of this project is being able to see squirrels regularly, right? So the last project was a book about kind of the global pig, but we don't see pigs because of the way confinement agriculture works. And the nice thing about writing about squirrels is I see squirrels every day. I see them in my neighborhood. I see them here at Cal State Long Beach. I see them when I'm out in the community. So it's really nice to think about the squirrel as a wild animal we can have a regular encounter with and think about.
Well, thank you for sharing this fascinating information with us today.
You're welcome.
And thank you for joining us for this edition of Talking Points. Be sure to join us again soon for the next episode. Until then, I'm Dave Kelly. Have a nice day.